Thank you all so much for having us and coming out this evening. I know that you have we heard that there's quite the traffic to get through here in Charlotte. Well, one of the things that's really special about being here is that Cecilia and I have been friends for a really long time. And we are both from the South, and our families come from Latino backgrounds as well. So we've been very excited to tell these stories and be connected to them. And we finally intersected in a way that we can do it and be here in conversation together. The history of Latinos in the U.S. South, in terms of historians writing about Latinos in the region, it's something that is relatively new. We are now, you all here with us are what, 2 of the 5?
Although one of them's in the audience, hiding in a pink blazer.
Here we are. There she is.
Perla Guerrero.
Perla Guerrero, who is here. She's the author of Nuevo South and one of the people who we really looked up to in the process of writing these books. So I want to turn to you.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about your book and how you came to the project?
Yeah, thank you all for being here. This is so lovely. It's actually my first time in Charlotte, and so this has been I'm in Durham, so I have no excuse. But it's been a lovely welcome so far. So I'm excited to be here with you all. So my book, Making the Latino South, A History of Racial Formation, I came to this book almost a decade ago now. I was at Shaw University, which is an HBCU in Raleigh, where they were having the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's 50th anniversary conference. So the SNCC is the shorthand for those who don't know, is a youth-led civil rights organization in the 1960s. They were doing the kind of direct action work that some other organizations shied away from. And I went there as an undergrad to interview the people I'd been reading about, right? I was taking this class on Black women in the civil rights movement, and I got to go and interview all of them. And it was just like in this unbelievable experience. And on the last day, we were in the kind of like final plenary, and Harry Belafonte was there, rest in peace, and he was sort of speaking. And this man walks by me, and I see his name tag. It says Luis Zapata. And I was like, interesting. Like, I haven't seen any Latinos here. Like, this is so exciting to me. So I like follow him out. I chase him down, which is like a very embarrassing thing to be doing as an undergrad, like chasing down this like older man. And I'm like, were you in SNCC? Like, he's like, yeah, I was. I was actually a United Farm Worker in California, and I came to help organize in Mississippi as part of the Mississippi Freedom Labor Union. And so me and him got to talking. We talked several times, and I went to graduate school planning to write about Latinos in the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And then I found all 5 of them and was like, uh-oh, I think this is a great chapter, but maybe not a whole dissertation. And so from there, I mean, part of the stories that I was getting to hear from these SNCC activists and core Congress of Racial Equality core activists that were Latino activists organizing in the South in the civil rights movement was that they weren't there alone, that there were other Latinos living in these communities. And so I decided I wanted to learn more about those communities and understand who were the Latinos living in the South, not just folks coming in to organize, but who was there sort of in between the civil rights movement, what was going on. And so that's really how the project came together. It became about the history of Latinos in the South from 1940 to 2010. And I was really interested in thinking about how ideas about Latinos and how the racial experience of Latinos changes over that time period. And there's sort of 2 big ideas in the book. The first is that where and when you are Latino matters a lot, which is to say, to be Latino in 1940s Washington, D.C. was quite different than 1940s California, for example. That to be Latino in 1990s Georgia is quite different than 1990s California even. Right? And so where and when you are Latino shapes what that means. So that's one of the big ideas. The other big idea that I was thinking that sort of came out of this work was that what it means to be Latino is always shaped in relation to Blackness. And that's something that we really see in the South, that it's about Blackness and anti-Blackness that are really shaping the boundaries of what Latino-ness is. So that category throughout time I show is always defined in relation to the Black communities that are also present in the South. So those were some of the sort of like big ideas, and I'd be happy to kind of dig into specific chapters and some of the other ideas in the Q&A. But those are the kind of big ideas that I'm working with in the piece, or in the book. So would you like to share about how you came to your work and what you ended up writing about?
Sure. So my book has a bit of a different origin story, and perhaps an origin story that a lot of us can relate to. So for me, much of the book, or where it came from and the ideas, it began for me with a photo that my grandmother showed me when I was growing up. And it was this picture that ran in the Tampa Bay Times originally in 1990. But my grandmother was from this community called Ybor City. And it is this Cuban community in Tampa, Florida. And it's located kind of to the outskirts, to the eastern outskirts of the city. And Ybor City was well known because it was where people went to make Cuban cigars, which, fun fact of the day, if you didn't know, until the 1960s, the majority of the Cuban cigars that were made in the world were made in Florida. They were not made on the island of Cuba. And that was a symptom of the late 1880s independence movements and economic instability on the island for a period of time. So manufacturers brought the cigar factories to Florida. They imported workers from Cuba, and that was how they were able to claim that they made Cuban cigars in the handmade fashion. And they imported the tobacco, because that's the one thing you couldn't do in the United States. They tried, but they could not grow Cuban tobacco here. So my mom's family, my grandmother's family, they were cigar workers in this community. And I grew up knowing this and living in Ybor City. And I always say that Ybor City felt like water to me. Like there was nothing special about it. It was like turning on the faucet. I could not have imagined that there was anything that would at one point become a book about this community. It was just who we were and what we did, the way we celebrated, the way that we were. But at the time, when I was a teenager in the early 2000s, showing our age now, here we are. My grandmother showed me this image, and she clipped it years ago. She had this binder that she carried around, and she would collect all these things about the community, and that she would just keep them. I call it her portable archive that she would carry around. And she showed me this image, and it was this picture of thousands of women marching through the streets of Tampa. And she takes a pen and she draws the arrows to different people. And she's indicating the women in our family who are part of this march. And at the time, the discussion, and I didn't know enough then to ask what was happening or why did this matter. I was 16 years old and was probably like, great, so glad that we had this moment. But it took going to really going to undergrad. I went to the University of Florida. And that was the first time where I was in an environment where I started to understand that the idea of what it meant to be Cuban American was very different from a mass stereotype and even from other areas of the state than it was growing up in Tampa. I knew that in Tampa that there were consistently leftist politics, that you had a Cuban foundation that made up a Democratic Party. And then I was introduced to something that was very different that I came to learn was what we most often associate with what does it mean to be Cuban American in the United States. And from that, I started to question and think about what kind of a book can we think about and what kind of questions can we ask, right? That oftentimes there's stereotypes that we think about or that we associate with different people. But the reality is that when we're thinking about Latinidad, that we're talking about vast groups of people, many of whom understand themselves in different ways, even down to people who come from these same places, because their migration patterns matter. So the group of people who I write about in the story that I tell, it begins in the 1880s and it ends in the 1960s, and it chronicles 3 generations of people. It watches and analyzes how their politics change over time, from arriving in Florida as ardent anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists to becoming foundational members of the Socialist and Communist Party, and by becoming the foundation of what becomes the Democratic Party, of Latinos who were part of the Democratic Party in Florida and continue to be so. Right, so understanding how people's politics shift, but also how women were a driving force in that, how images of women were central to that, and how women were also political makers. And, consistently, and one of the things that Cecilia and I have in common is one of the things that we find is how people present themselves. In my book, I also talk about how Florida is, and Tampa operated as this borderland, right? This place where people were always vying for influence, not necessarily a borderland in terms, well, of course, in terms of how we think of people moving across nations and across physical borders, but also the way that the city shifted, right? Who had control of what space over time? If people were in control of their labor, what kind of influence did they have over politics? If people were demanding representation in terms of politics with their voices and their bodies, what were they able to counter in terms of Jim Crow? But as labor broke down with time, people began to make different types of choices, racialized choices. And what they too began to do is define themselves against Blackness, at least those who could. Because one thing about Tampa and one thing about the Cuban community there is that it was multiracial. There was a sizable Afro-Cuban population. But the way and the types of race-based choices people make with time shifts, which I think brings us to an important question about your book.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really connects. It connects so much to my work. I mean, one of the things that I try to do in the project is really be clear about it's understanding that underneath the category of Latino, there's a lot of racial difference, right? And so trying to be clear about when I'm talking about Black Latino, when I'm talking about non-Black Latino, being sort of specific there. And one of the things that I look at throughout the book is the differential experiences that those folks have. So again, sort of the project runs like 1940 to 2010, and I think it sort of roughly fits into a few different time periods. One is sort of pre-1970, 1980. I'm sure those of you who have been in Charlotte and North Carolina for a while know why that is. That in 1980 is when we start to see the large-scale migration of Latinos to the U.S. South. I mean, this is a result of sort of changing economic structures, active recruitment from industry, but also passage of legislation from the federal government. And so before the 1980s, what I find is that Latinos are living, non-Black Latinos are living in the South is what I call provisionally white. So what that means is that they are able to access many of the privileges of whiteness. That means they can live in white schools, live in white neighborhoods, attend white schools, often intermarry with white families, but they can't do other things. You know, they can't join the fraternal organizations. They can't join the Klan, right? Being Catholic, having sort of Spanish last name, those sort of things that sort of marked them as distinct. And so when I look at the different experiences of Latinos, this really comes to the fore. So I think about the story of someone like Manuel Aguirre, and he's a man who comes to West Virginia, actually, to serve in the military. He's sort of briefly in West Virginia to serve in the military. And he tells this story where he says, everywhere I went, it was whites and blacks, you know, we're talking about Jim Crow signage in the 1940s. And he's like, I didn't, you know, it was the weirdest thing. I had never seen this before where I came from. And what he says is I chose the white entrances because I wasn't Black. And that's a refrain that I actually heard a lot, that when non-Black Latinos were confronted with Jim Crow signage, the kind of white or colored entrances, they would regularly choose the white one, not necessarily because they identified as white, not necessarily because they were being perceived as white, but because they identified as not Black. And if you think about that in contrast with someone like Bob de Leon, who was another soldier who was serving in Georgia at the time, he's an Afro-Puerto Rican man from New York. And he tells a pretty wild story where he says, so he's serving in Georgia, they've stopped over in Columbus, and he runs to the bathroom, and he ends up accidentally using the white bathroom. And a patrolman comes in and is sort of like looming over him, you know, threateningly. And he says, do you see something you like? That's what Bob de Leon says, which is like the craziest story. It's also like, as someone who loves many New Yorkers, it's like a deeply New York story where it's like the swagger cannot be stopped. And so he ultimately is able to get out, and it ends up being okay. But he has these kinds of constant confrontations with Jim Crow that are quite different than his non-Black Latino peers. And so part of what I'm thinking about in the book is, what does it mean to tell a Latino history of the South without really reckoning with the fact that we were having different experiences along lines of race, right? That to tell a Latino history of the South is inherently to tell a segregated history. It's a story about non-Black Latinos and Black Latinos, right? And that different experience. And so that's kind of at the heart of the project, is really reckoning with that difference within Latino communities and how that has shaped our history. And of course, things will change in the story, right? When we get to the 1980s, again, when and where we are Latino matters. By the 1980s, we're looking at a much more working class Latino population. They're being actively recruited to do things like working in poultry, working in construction, working in manufacturing. It's a different population of Latinos who are all of a sudden here. And so the reception is different. So things will change over time. But I'm sort of, I'm interested in how in Jim Crow, this population is actually quite sortable. They're actually, there's all these stories that we tell about Latinos disrupting the black-white binary. And I think some of that is valuable. And I think some of it, when we look at the South in particular, doesn't really hold water, that Latinos actually were quite sortable in this moment, with a lot of sorting happening. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about it. But one of the things that I really value in your work, that is something that I don't take up quite as much, that you ended your last answer with, was thinking about gender and women in particular, but gender more broadly. Because I think about, in my own work, when we get to the 1980s, one of the things that happens is that it's not, first we get this kind of wave of single men arriving, but then when women and children show up, things really change in the South, right? When women and children start accessing things like schools and social services and all of these different things are different. So I'm just curious if you could talk a bit about like gender and women and how that's sort of like a central part of your own thinking.
Absolutely. So women obviously play a central role in my book. It's a history of the Latina South, right? How Latinos are central to both political making, to community making, and to family making, and how those ideas change and shift with time. So, right, like I mentioned, my book isn't centering on the Cuban American story that so many of us know, right? The post-1959 story. Instead, I'm looking at groups of people who came to the United States initially, right, during the 1880s and then continued to come, right, during the 1910s, 1920s, and things begin to fall off during the 1930s with the Great Depression, of course. But the reasons that they came, the politics they had, were distinctly different, and that was also mimicked in the kind of community that they made. So Ybor City was interesting because it was so independent. And the people who lived there were powerful, especially while the Cuban cigar industry was incredibly powerful. They created things like mutual aid societies. And when I say a mutual aid society, I don't mean what we generally think of a mutual aid society. I mean, imagine a 3-story building that looks like it has classical architecture that people gave money in order to build, right? And people, the way that they were working and the role of women within work, women were a part of a working-based culture. They were active in unions and they were active in politics. But the reality is that the beginning of the story that I tell, especially in the early years, and most of the work that's been done on Ybor City centers on those early periods because it is a really powerful period of time. If you want a story that is about how groups of Latinos can completely shut down a city, they had the ability to do that. Because this group of people, they were the economic heart of the city. When people moved there, the population went from being about 780 people in 1885 to 15 years later, more than 1,000. And by the time that we get to World War II, Tampa is a majority people of color city, right? That starts to shift after 1946 and the arrival of MacDill Air Force Base and the way that the population changes thereafter, right? But that meant that the way that the city operated was distinct. Latinos in Ybor City were particularly powerful while the cigar industry was powerful. But in the 1930s, that shifts. Cigars are expensive and cigarettes are cheap, and people became interested in cigarettes, especially during wartime periods. And they're more accessible, they're easier to buy, people can afford them. So the cigar industry declines. You go from having about 200 factories to all of a sudden 20. But one of the things that's really interesting about this process is that the reaction, the men who used to be the primary breadwinners, men who were predominantly employed, are almost unilaterally fired. And women are hired in their place. So in a very short period of time, within roughly a 2-year period of time, you have an industry and you have an entire economy that is built upon men making much more money, having these much more powerful positions, to women who are the money makers. They are running the economy. They are the ones who are joining unions. They are the ones who have the ability to run and demand what politics looks like. And they do those things. But one of the things that I write about and that I talk about is what their politics and what, especially when we think about ideas like feminism, what those things looked like, right? Organizing and demanding equity on the basis of an entire community, not on the basis of an individual person. Because people were talking very much about ideas of living wage. It didn't necessarily serve anyone for all men to be out of work and for all women to work, right? It meant that it made it harder for an entire family structure. But what this one moment does is that it creates an avenue for women to be these vocal voices. And it creates an entree and it breaks this division that had existed within the city of Tampa for a long period of time. Because all of a sudden, what's different when the Cuban cigar industry isn't the only employer is that you have Latinos who need to be employed by people within the city of Tampa. You need to have access to WPA funding. You have people who have the ability to get that access, but that it's operated differently. Women become the advocates. They become the way that they are creating a way to have Latinos enter the city of Tampa as power holders. They start to shift how politics work. They start to make sure that people can register, that they can become elected, right? And women are the ones who are creating these coalitions. They have power in a unique moment, and they use their voices. This is really remarkable because men had tried to do these things. But living in the Jim Crow South means that there are specific issues at play. The city of Tampa in 1935, according to the ACLU, was one of the places that had the highest rates of lynching anywhere in the U.S. South. People who were experiencing violence were those who were right, of course, when we're thinking about Jim Crow, but it was also on the basis of unionism. It was also on the basis of politics. There is a massive letter writing campaign that happens after a union leader is beaten to death by police officers. Right? It is the first time that anybody's actually charged or brought forward in an attack that ends in the death of an individual through vigilante action. Right? But women have the ability during the same period of time to do things like, if we go back to that image that my grandmother showed me, to walk through the streets in the thousands in a way that Latinos, men who work to do the same thing, ended in visceral repercussions. And women mobilize that action in ways that we see in similar areas in different regions of the South, right? I think about histories of Atlanta. I think about histories in other places. And recognizing the role that women play as advocates and as community makers and as political power holders is something that is important and central to my work. Yeah. And with that.
Well, now we wanted to talk about, I think we were transitioning to thinking about our favorite stories from our books.
I know my favorite story from your book, but,
Yeah. Well, let me ask a question first. Do people know south of the border, the rest stop? Is this a place that people have been?
Yeah.
It seems like a mix. All right, cool. So for those who have been, I'm so sorry. It's such a weird place. For those who haven't been, I will explain a little bit. This is probably my favorite chapter to research. So south of the border is it's in South Carolina, right at the North and South Carolina border. It's in Hamer, South Carolina. And it's originally south of the border because parts of North Carolina go dry, which means they ban alcohol in the 1930s. And so they're signaling, when they call it south of the border, it's originally to be like, look, you can get booze here. It's like, this is a place where you can get alcohol. And so it started it starts sort of in 1949 by Alan Schaefer, who's a Jewish entrepreneur from the Dillon, South Carolina area. And shortly after it starts as this kind of like alcohol depot, it takes on a Mexican theme. So for those who haven't been, it's kind of like a racist Disney on the side of the road. That's also like falling apart. And so it's like a place like today where you could go and get like a Confederate flag, a dream catcher, and like a sombrero. Like it's like the weirdest place.
Fireworks.
And fireworks. That's mostly what it is now.
Yeah.
Most of you who have been there probably were because you had to go get fireworks. And so again, condolences that you had to be there. And so I was sort of interested. Most of my chapters are obviously about like actual Latinos and how actual Latinos live and move through the South. But my chapter on South of the Border is really thinking about how ideas about Latinos are traveling separate from Latinos. So there isn't a Latino community in the area when it forms, right? And so I'm like, that's weird, right? Like, what's going on? Why a Mexican theme in South Carolina? So it's, again, so it started by Alan Schaefer. It started in 1949. It sort of keeps expanding. The main character, the more racist Mickey Mouse is Pedro. So again, for those who have seen it, you probably have seen like the billboards where it's like, Pedro says, go to south of the border. That's Pedro, right? And so one of the things I was interested in, I was looking through the archives of this place, trying to kind of like understand like why in 1949 does this Jewish man think Mexico? That's the ticket. And so there's a couple things that come out. One is, of course, this is a time when people are starting to actually go to places like Mexico and Latin America as like air travel and highway travel is expanding. But that isn't really true for everyone. And if you're like a local in Dillon, South Carolina, you're probably not like going to Cuba and you're not going to Mexico. And so it becomes a way for locals to get to play with ideas about travel in Latin America and what they imagine Latin America is, right? That's about booze, it's about beautiful women, it's about food, it's like all of the ideas that they have about Latin America, they get to kind of go play with those there. And so that's one of the things. The other thing, though, I noticed when I was reading about this is that Pedro has a Southern accent, y'all. He has a Southern accent. And I was like, what is this? So he does, so the way that, so in the Dillon Herald, which is the local newspaper, Pedro, the mascot, again, not a real person, has a column that he sort of reports every week about what's happening at south of the border. Most of it is in what they call Mexi speak. It's kind of what you can imagine. It's this like Speedy Gonzalez, like broken English, caricature, cartoonish version of English. And, but it has these like Southern inflections. So I'm like, again, what is going on here? This is so fascinating. Why make him Southern? Why give their version of Speedy Gonzalez a Southern accent in addition to this kind of accent? And so then by 1961, what's sort of fascinating is that in 1961, it's the centennial, it's the 100-year anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. And so Alan Schaefer decides to open Confederate land at south of the border. So it's a Confederate theme park within the Mexican theme park at south of the border. So Pedro, again, Mickey Mouse, but this kind of Mexican character, is in a Confederate uniform. They open Fort Pedro. They open Pedro's Plantation. All of these little like attractions that are oriented around a Confederate theme and Pedro. Like, girl, what is going on here, right? As I'm going through these archives, I'm like, what is happening? This is wild. Because again, I mean, this is going back to this idea of when and where you are Latino matters, which is like, why isn't this just what's happening in the racist ideas about Latinos in California? Why aren't we just picking those up and dropping them in South Carolina? They're changing them. They're changing them to make them Southern, right? They're changing ideas about Latinos that are formed in the West and Southwest to help them meet Southern needs. And part of the argument that I make is 1961 is also not coincidentally the beginning of the sit-in movement in North Carolina, not far from where south of the border is happening. The civil rights movement is pulsing through North and South Carolina in this moment, right? Things like blackface minstrelsy are no longer really like socially appropriate. And then south of the border becomes this place that white people in particular can go to play with ideas about race, to play with ideas about racial domination, and to kind of escape the world that is changing all around them. All these ideas about race are changing in their world, and then they get to go and transport themselves to this wild place, right? So Confederate land was probably like my favorite find because there's this like absolutely bizarre image of Alan Schaefer, again, a Jewish man from Dillon, South Carolina, with his like leg up on a cannon in a Confederate uniform, and underneath it says Colonel Pedro, but misspelled to be this kind of Mexi speak. And I was like, what? The layers of things that are happening here of this kind of like Jewish man who's kind of pretending to be Pedro, but also pretending to be Confederate land. Anyway, so that was like it was really important for me to get this idea that Southerners were not just receiving ideas about Latinos from the West and the Southwest, they were changing them when they got here, that there were particularly Southern ideas about who Latinos were and who they could be for us. And I think that that's important because one of the things that's happening in this moment in 1961 is this kind of surge of lost cause stuff, right? This idea of, combating the civil rights movement. It's this reimagining of what the Civil War was, this reimagining of what plantation slavery was, to say that this was a war fought by brothers. It was about sort of the South was this like noble cause that just couldn't sort of stand up to Northern aggression, basically, right? They're repurposing, recasting what the Civil War actually was. And they want Latinos to help, right? They're imagining a Latino at the heart of that movement. Like the way that an imagined Latino person could be sort of slotted into their lost cause narratives becomes really interesting to me, that they can, this imaginary Mickey Mouse Pedro gets to serve the Confederacy, right? This is bizarre. And so trying to understand how ideas about Latinos are moving is part of what's really interesting to me. There's some really good pictures in the book, let me tell you. It is an absolute trip. So that was my favorite to research. And I also went there, and I went there in the winter, which is like the low time, because usually now it's more locals. It's like people going to Myrtle Beach and things like that. It's really spooky. It's like a spooky, abandoned, racist Disney. I was like, ooh, this is not going to end well for me. But I went, so for service of you all and knowledge. So that was mine. Could you want to share your favorite story, which I know is a little less whimsical and a bit sweeter?
I guess it is a bit sweeter. I'll spice it up with a few different ones. So one of the things about my book is that I agonize forever about how to write it. Being a person and writing about the community from which you're from, in a way, it sounds like, oh, that would be simple. It is terribly difficult. Reconciling where your family or where your own legacy lies within this is incredibly difficult, to the point where the elements of my family that are in the book were not in it until, the last few months? Until the absolute deadline that this thing had to go to press. So those are things that are real. But before I jump into that story, as I'm sitting here thinking, right, one of the stories that is important to me and always has been, that really stood out to me, is the story of Luisa Moreno, who is the second chapter of my book. If you don't know who Luisa Moreno is, she is one of the most well-known Latina labor activists who organized in the United States. She has been a Google Doodle. My students always find that fascinating. They really enjoy that. But her story, for so many reasons, sums up why thinking about the South is really important. Luisa Moreno, she was born Blanca Rosa Rodriguez de Leon, and she's from Guatemala. She was born into a wealthy family. She had every privilege available to her. She was educated in the United States. She spoke English without an accent. But she decides to reject her family, probably right in her early 20s, not fully thinking it all through, and goes to Mexico City, where she becomes a part of the Frida Kahlo Diego Rivera scene. She becomes a poet and a journalist. She falls in love, and they decide to move to New York City. And it's when she's in New York City where all of those things start to fall apart. Her husband becomes an alcoholic. The artist's life isn't exactly serving them the way that they imagined that it would. And she gets work as a seamstress in Spanish Harlem. And it's while working as a seamstress that she sees the issues that women are facing. And to her, the moment that she talks about that changes her life is when one of the women with whom she worked asks her if she wants to meet her newborn baby. And she says, yeah, of course I do. And she takes her to her tenement that she shared. And there was a woman who was watching the child. And they hear this scream as they're coming up the stairs, or the sounds of a baby crying. And by the time they get to the top of the stairs, they see a rat that is sitting on the baby and eating its face. And she explains that as the origin story moment of when she thinks that things have to change. Right, that you're looking at women who are working these absurdly long hours to make very little wages, and that the realities of their lives are not accounted for in what their work life looks like. So living in New York City, she creates the first labor union for Latinas who were seamstresses. And it becomes a hugely successful union. So successful that it gains the American Federation of Labor, which had zero interest in supporting women or creating unions around women, because for many labor unions, the idea of unionizing women worked in contrast to what their goals were, which was to protect men's labor. Women were competitors for men's labor. That's why there were not the same type of support for labor unions that were for women. So they identify that she is talented at this. And there is this community in Florida where all of a sudden you have women who are the predominant workers and they are refusing to join the union. They cannot figure out a union organizer who can organize them. So she goes to Florida. And when she's in Florida, the chapter and the way that I write about her is that it's in Florida where, and in the South, in this context, where she becomes the organizer who she ends up being. When she's in Florida, she watches the women in Ybor City as they are blending unionism with politics. And they are advocating for both of these things at the same time, because they firmly do not believe that either single avenue has the ability to meet their needs, and that there has to be a blend of both things. And with time, she starts to adopt very similar tactics, to the point where by the time that there is this big union meeting in Tampa, the AFL meeting in 1936. This is actually a really important meeting. It's when the CIO becomes its own independent union, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which today is the AFL-CIO. They were separate for a period of time, and they became separate at this meeting. She gives a big speech against the American Federation of Labor. She talks about how they refuse to speak in support of anti-fascism, how they refuse to acknowledge what fascist action looks like in the South. Because those women in my grandmother's photo that I will keep coming back to, right, the things that they were marching against, they marched from their community to the front steps of City Hall. And what they did is that they demanded recognition of themselves as people who lived in this space and lived in this community and worked and had the ability for their voices and their ideas to be recognized, and that they should be by authorities of both the city as well as the nation, right? They wanted this petition to be sent to the President of the United States, that they become active in the global anti-fascist movement, right? Specifically the Spanish Civil War. But they also consistently wrote into local newspapers talking about fascist actions by City of Tampa officials. They're making links that fascism wasn't something that was ambient. It wasn't something that was happening somewhere else, but it was something that was happening there and that was specifically active. In the terms of Luisa Moreno, her name isn't Luisa Moreno when she gets to Ybor City. Her name is it's still Blanca. That was how she referred to herself. It's in Ybor City where she changes her name. She becomes Luisa Moreno whilst being there. And the way that another historian, her name is Vicky Ruiz, has written about this is that she conjugated her identity. And what that meant is that she chose to actively cast off who she was born as and embrace how other people viewed her or what she needed to do in order to be an active and a successful organizer. Luisa, the first name, is a homage to Luisa Capetillo, who is she is a famous Puerto Rican labor organizer and feminist. She's the first woman to write a feminist treatise out of the Caribbean. She lived and worked in Ybor City, and while she lived and worked in Ybor City, she wrote the second version of her feminist treatise, which was published by an anarchist publisher in Ybor City. The concept from Luisa Capetillo that really resonated and was a part of Moreno's story is one thing that Luisa Capetillo believed was that it was impossible while women have all of these expectations, it's impossible for anyone to be everything to everyone at the same time. And the story of Luisa Moreno's life, and especially her relationship to her daughter, which was very fraught, is that it's impossible to do that without access to family support or access to an active system where there are things like childcare, where there are different elements of social support within our own communities to where people are able to live equitable lives. So Luisa Moreno, she really adopts this in this period of time, and she becomes an outspoken political activist as well as one that is labor-based. While she's living in Florida, she begins to write poems, not just about the topics that she wrote about prior when she was involved in the Bohemian intelligentsia, but instead it's about what she sees as she's organizing people in fields, where she sees bodies hanging from trees. She starts to talk about what it's like to walk through a landscape where lynching is a part of everyday life, where the ideas of Jim Crow isn't something that is just ambient or a law, but it's something that is physical and that's visceral. And that shapes the way that she chooses to be and not be a labor unionist. She leaves the American Federation of Labor because of their very strict stance and their likelihood and their consistent accommodation to the to manufacturers as well as to Tampa power holders. And she becomes one of the founding members of the United Cannery and Packing House Workers of America Union, which was a popular front-based union and one of the most, some would say the most ambitious and the most diverse unions that existed in U.S. history. Her work and her consistent work for those ideas, right, the blending of politics with unionism. She is deported in 1946 as a result of anti-communist probing in California. So it was stories like that. Luisa Moreno, right, she is somebody who we can know about in a totally different context, right? You're in California, she's famous. But thinking about how people become who they are, right, the different areas that they touch, right? Luisa Moreno becomes the kind of organizer she was because she came to this region and she saw what this political system was like. She understood and saw race-based oppression in a way that was different than what she herself had interaction with in Mexico City and within New York, right? Something was different about the South, and it was so different that it shifted the way that people organized. And that was a lesson that she took with her. And so looking at that, right, and making sense of all of these different elements, right, it's one that centralizes women, what makes our politics so different, what made this community so unique, what made it this nexus and this borderland in this place where so many people from so many places came together, right, and where they organized or where they also found refuge, right? Luisa Capetillo is there because she's exiled from Cuba, famously for wearing pants, right? Or where people come to share their ideas, right? Eugene V. Debs was there, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, right? These were people who were found a place or where they sought to organize in this Southern community. And understanding that and that it was happening in a specific Jim Crow context is really important. So taking a figure as big as Luisa Moreno and saying, how was she made? And in that chapter, I love having the opportunity to like walk her through all the different things that perhaps she would have seen or the conversations that she would have had or the things she would have read or the cafes that she would have went to, the things she would have overheard, and how all of those different elements make a person, can make an organizer, can make a political activist, and can reshape not just a single place, not just a region, but national and international politics.
No, I really love that answer. I mean, so we wanted to talk a bit more about the to sort of transition. I mean, I think part of what you're saying in this moment is about
why the South.
Well, yeah, I mean, and what you're saying, right, is about like Luisa Moreno is the story that we don't really tell in the context of the South, and so what does it mean to put her in the South and tell it from that perspective? Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk a little bit about why we chose to write about the South, and then we'll open it up to y'all for questions. So this will be the last thing that we say about our own work, and then we can hear from you all. Do you want to say a bit about like why you chose to write about the South?
Sure. So I will say, right, my book is not the first one to write about Ybor City. There's another book on Ybor City, right, the immigrant world of Ybor City, Italians and their Latin neighbors. So it is very much about the Italian community that was there, which there was also an Italian community. It was very much a multi-ethnic community. There were Italians, there were some people who were Spaniards, there were some people who were Cuban but said they were Spaniards, right? It gets really complicated, especially as time goes on, right? My family is not exclusive from that. I grew up thinking that we were directly from Madrid. That is very inaccurate. And in the midst of the writing of the book, my mom just looked at me, don't don't tell your grandfather. I'm like, I'm pretty sure he knows. The jig is up. But right, all of these things about respectability politics were definitely a part of that, and a part of how people shifted who they were, how they talked about themselves, right? What kind of power structures did they want to have access to? But for me, right, you can write about Ybor City in a sense and how other people have written about it or told stories about it solely and squarely within Latin American history, right? The story of Ybor City can be, and oftentimes is, about Jose Marti, who, right, all these famous people, right? Jose Marti, who came to Ybor City, and how he helped organize for the Cuban independence movement, which the Cuban War for Independence, which in the United States we know as the Spanish-American War. It is the same conflict. Or it becomes the Spanish-American War in the final months, right? How we think of it here is different than the broader conflict. It can be that story of independence making, of there being a different community, right, that is in Tampa. We can oftentimes, and historians often think of Ybor City as being the place where the promises of the Cuban Revolution, where the promises of Cuban independence, right, of revolution making during the turn of the century, where you had a group of people who were able to see those ideas emerge and shift in a way that was outside the fraught political structures and imperial structures on the island. Right? Some historians have written about this. But what we don't oftentimes think about is if you take it outside of that isolation, if you look at it from a multi-generational perspective, if you recognize that all of these things are happening in the South, right? That people are not just operating independently. They're not living independently. They are living under this Jim Crow-based structure, right? There is something different about living in the South. Ybor City in and of itself exists in Tampa because in part of that structure. Key West was the first cigar-making community. It's moved to Tampa because cigar manufacturers want increased control, and Tampa could promise that. So if we think about that idea of control, if we think about the different elements that make a place, right, that make a city, and that make a state, right, and make a region, right, that it has distinct stories to tell. Right, that it has stories to tell about how racial restriction operates, right, from moments when it is rather murky to when you are looking at things when they are much more categorized. But also how Latinos learn to navigate these stories, but navigate these systems, but then also are complicit and play a part within regulating them and enforcing them. Yeah, I think that, especially when I'm home in Tampa, that is the hardest part of the story to tell.
No, I mean, I think that really connects to when I think about why I wrote about this, why I decided to write about the South. I mean, I think maybe to just zoom back out for a second, I write in the first part about this kind of like category of provisional whiteness. And then as, again, those of you who are from Charlotte or from North Carolina or the South know, things changed dramatically in the 1980s. And by the 1990s, I talk about how Latino, so I write about Dalton, Georgia in the fourth chapter. I don't know why anyone would know anything about Dalton, Georgia, but sort of similar to the Cuban story, fully 2/3 of the U.S.'s carpet was made in Dalton in the 1990s, also known as the carpet capital of the world. It's on their billboards. They're very proud of it. And I will also tell you, as someone who recently bought a house, like when you're trying to buy carpet, like it was real weird because I was like, oh, I write about all these companies and not in a great way. So that was an odd process that I don't recommend. But what I talk about is in the 1990s, the carpet manufacturing, in addition to like poultry processing and other sort of food processing companies, start to recruit Latinos to the South to fill these growing industries. These industries are growing in the South at a time that they're actually contracting in other parts of the country. And so I talk about how in the 1990s, and this is kind of like in the Olympics era, Latinos come to the South and they're really welcomed in this sort of like surprising way. At the same time that Prop 187, which is this anti-immigrant legislation that was in California in the 1990s, is happening, Latinos are showing up in Dalton, Georgia, and they're opening a bilingual education program. It's this kind of surprisingly warm welcome. And part of the reason is because of these industries desperately needing Latino labor to be able to fill the carpet, to be able to fill the carpet factories, the poultry processing factory, all of these different things. And so I talk about how in the 1990s, Latinos are really welcomed as hardworking Hispanic immigrants, this kind of hardworking category. And again, I think that's a really complicated category. I have lots of big feelings about it that I'd love to talk about. I think the difference between hardworking and able to be worked hard is important. And I think, and then what happens after the 1990s, as I talk about, as a combination of 9/11 and the Great Recession, results in what we might sort of think about the South today, which is the treatment of many Latinos as illegal aliens, as sort of foreign to this place. And so what I talk about in those last two chapters is how the same people who are welcomed as the lifeblood of these small Southern towns, who are invigorating small Southern economies and saving small Southern cities that are sort of going under, all those hardworking, as they're called, people become seen as illegal aliens, right? And so the exact same families, right? And this matters, right? Like, people have kids and their kids are somehow of a different population than that. You know, they were hardworking and now they're not anymore. What? Like, this is sort of to be able to track that and see that. And a lot of the last chapter is set here in North Carolina, was really striking to me. And it's a really different timeline that when we think about, you know, for those of you who have taken AP US history, or those of you whose kids have taken AP US history, it's like, you're like, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, that is all. Goodbye. You know, like, that's all the Latino history you're going to get. See you next year. And so I think being able to understand, like, this isn't Cesar Chavez's history, right? It's a different timeline. Things are happening differently here in the South. And being able to talk about that and why things are changing is part of the reason I was invested in the South, that it's a different Latino history than the one that we've been told. And part of my investment in is this idea that Latinos are always treated as foreign and as sort of new arrivals, no matter what. It's kind of like the new Latino vote, the new Latino, you know, consumer, you know, we're always brand new to wherever we are, right? And I think this is, you know, part of the story that we're both telling is, like, first of all, we're not new. We've been here for a long time, and that's really important. And so we get to claim the South. The South is Latino. Latinos are Southern. And I think that's really, you know, to be able to tell this much longer history, there's this way that Latinos are treated as foreign to the South, as different from the South, because we're not part of these big moments in Southern history, but we are. And being able to talk about that really means that these Latino communities that are treated as foreign, we get to claim our Southernness. And what I also think is important, though, is that we also need to reckon with our Southern histories. We get to claim the South, we get to claim those parts of it, but we also need to be accountable to the ways that means we are implicated in Southern history too. The ways that we've benefited, for some of us have benefited from those structures that are part of the Southern, about white supremacy, about Jim Crow, about segregation. And so we both get to claim it and we need to be accountable to it. And so to me, that's really why the South, right? Is that I think that we needed to be able, I mean, some people have started to do this, to tell the history of the South and putting Latinos at the center, but more of us need to be doing it constantly, because it's really a big and complicated history. And it's one that I think we can't build meaningful communities, meaningful coalitions in the South, you know, activist organizations that are trying to sort of build with historic civil rights organizations in the South. We can't do that without meaningfully understanding our own legacies in this place. And so that's really why I feel invested in sort of telling this history, is in part as a way that we can imagine Southern futures for Latinos, that I see the future of the South as I see it has Latinos in it, right? And so I want us to be able to understand where we're coming from as in part as a way to imagine a kind of a new future that sort of centers a Latino-ness that is critical of anti-Blackness, a Latino-ness that is sort of embedded in the South and all of those histories and is accountable to that history. So that's my South. I get very excited talking about the South. As you can tell, I'm like very invested. I mean, so this is also complicated. I'm from Northern Virginia. Is anyone here from Northern Virginia? I don't know why you would be. But it's I know we're in Charlotte, but I just like to ask. We can like rep our cities. It's a very contested place. Like, my cousins from Georgia are like, you are not from the South, girl. But then when I went to school outside of Philly, they're like, you're from the deep South. You know what I mean? They're like, oh, we don't go past Philly. You know, we don't go past Maryland, basically. And so whether or not I'm Southern is like this kind of up for grabs question.
I think you are.
Of course I am.
I mean,
people are wrong. People are wrong all the time. But I'm just saying, like, I mean, I grew up with like Robert E. Lee's, you know, burial site right by me. It's a whole thing. But anyway, I'm invested in it too, because, you know, I think about the histories that we're telling in our classes. We've been here for a long time. We also every year we have more and more Latino young people entering into our high schools, our middle schools, our elementary schools, and we don't have content really to be able. I mean, we're just developing it now. I think in the past 5-10 years, of like, how do we tell the history of Latinos in this area such that Latinos can see themselves reflected in Charlotte? You're not, that this is places like Charlotte, places like North Carolina, places like the South. So I guess I'll step off my soapbox, although you did give me a microphone, so it's your fault. And maybe we can use this as an opportunity to open it up to questions from you all.
I have to echo the things and sort of the recognition of how being Black and Latina, and in the South, it's not a choice, right? So it was beautifully said. So I also wanted to commemorate the fact that I also been an advocate for Latinos for the last 20 years in the South. I don't know why I'm crying, but it's just beautifully to hear the recognition that we've been here. In the fact that so many Latinos that we advocated for have not felt recognized by the contributions of what we stand on today. So I just wanted to say that it's beautifully said. You're from Durham, but we felt it here in Charlotte as well. I think the thing that I just wanted to ask you about, because I think it's important to think about the categories of the cost that it has when you have to sort of be attached to a category that is not yours, whether it's white or Black. Because even if I'm very proud to be Black, but I'm not a Latina, I was not born here, and I don't recognize all the cultural recognitions that sometimes they have and they unite on. And I think that equally may have happened to Latinos who are not white, who also have to be attached to a category that is not theirs. So I do wonder, are there stories that sort of touch on that? Because I think it's important that you sort of have to not say it, but still live it as part of being Latina in the South.
Yeah. Sorry, can you say your name?
My name is Raquel Lynch.
Raquel, thank you so much for your question, Raquel. I think that is, well, first of all, thank you for sharing. I mean, that was really beautiful. And I really hope that we get to connect a little bit, because there's stories, and there's a story in chapter 2, I think, that's about Fatima Cortez, who's this Afro-Puerto Rican activist who comes to organize with the Congress of Racial Equality. Like, Black Latinos have been here. I'm at Duke. I'm working on this project about the history of Latinos at Duke. Black Latinos are at North Carolina Central. Black Latinos are at Shaw. Black Latinos are at HBCUs, and they are like, it's a presence, right? And have been here. Your question about racial categories, I think that it's, what's interesting, so I'll talk about maybe a bit about Fatima Cortez. So she's an Afro-Puerto Rican woman born and raised in Washington Heights, New York. And she comes down to Louisiana to organize with the Congress of Racial Equality. And it's actually funny. She also, the story, so her father is not in the picture. The story is also that he's pure Spaniard. He isn't. Again, as it seems like everyone has a pure Spaniard, someone, but he's Puerto Rican. And so she comes to the South identifying as Spanish. She that's what she sort of said. She's like, I'm a Spanish girl. And everyone in the South is like, okay, but that's not going to work here, right? And so what's interesting is she's sort of constantly, coming from New York, where there's this kind of like multiracial Latino community. It's pretty different than the South. She comes to the South and they're kind of like, look, this is how race works here. You're either Black or you're not Black, right? It's actually not even, I sort of argue, it's not really about Black and white. It's about Black and not Black. And so she is, they're kind of like, yeah, I get that you're Latino. And like she tells these funny stories where she's like a Tito Puente song would come on and they're like, all right, Fatima. But like, that's kind of the extent of it, like when they were handing out, assignments, like she's going into a Black community. That's like where she would be placed and things like that. The other thing that I will say is that I always want to be clear that some of the Latinos that I'm looking at are coming straight to the South from Latin America. Some of them are sort of second stops. They've already sort of landed in the U.S. But what I never want to say, I always want to be clear that Latinos do not learn racism in the South, right? We know that from Latin America, And so while, I hear lots of stories from people, there's a woman, Antonia Pantoja, who talks about the first time she's in Louisiana. She's from Puerto Rico. And she's like talking also about the signage, right? The signage is so weird to her, the white color, the sort of front back of the bus. These things are very strange to her. But what isn't strange is kind of like racial hierarchy, right? Like they have that in Puerto Rico too. And so while I think they learn a new way of practicing race in the South, it's not totally foreign to them, right? I think that those racial hierarchies exist in Latin America too. But I really appreciate the question.
When you're talking about Afro-Latinidad, right, one of the things, at least like when I'm looking at Ybor City and the stories that I didn't tell or to think about, is that Afro-Latinos were a big part of the migration pattern that came to Florida in the original migration in the 1880s. To where, but right, when you're saying right, that people bring ideas with them, right, they absolutely did. Race operated differently on the island of Cuba, but it absolutely operated. But the way that race operated was different, and it did shift and shape the way that the community functioned. There were certain things that never changed, right? Like you have the CMIU in Tampa, which was consistently interracial. So Afro-Cubans were always a part of it. But that was not how unionism worked in any other capacity. It was segregated because it was the South. So the idea of bringing traditions with people and advocating for them and them finding a place, they absolutely did. But one of the differences in becoming or being in the South was also restrictions playing a new way in different forms. Right? There was a singular Cuban mutual aid society initially. And as soon as Ybor City becomes part of Hillsborough County, it's forcibly segregated. And you end up with two different mutual aid societies, both of which still exist today. One is called the Círculo Cubano, and the other is the Sociedad de la Unión Martí Maceo. So Jose Martí being Jose Martí, the large figure of the independence movement, and General Maceo, right, the Afro-Cuban general who fought for Cuban independence, right? So illustrating its unity. The Sociedad Martí Maceo still exists, but it became this space of Afro-Cuban pride. They had education classes that taught the history of Afro-Latinidad to members. It made sure that it kept language alive, that there were dances for Afro-Latinos, and that it continuously celebrated Afro-Latinidad and created this space within the community, right? But over time, the Afro-Cuban Club, the Sociedad Martí Maceo, it's the only of all, when you're talking about different experiences, in the midst of urban renewal, Ybor City comes under fire. The only mutual aid society that isn't saved is the Sociedad Martí Maceo. It does have a new space that is down in the community, but it's much smaller than the others. Right? And the story of what happens to Afro-Cubans is that it intersects with histories of the NAACP. One of the leaders of Ybor City, of the Afro-Cuban clubs, ends up being one of the first Afro-Latinos who was elected as the head of the NAACP in Tampa and becomes a community advocate. And there's this one big moment, right, when Ybor City's falling apart during urban renewal. And people are trying to figure out what to do. And the answer that they keep coming to is to remove certain people from the community. And it's his name is Frank Rodriguez, who comes to this meeting and he just speaks and he says, I have lived in both worlds. Right? He was in World War II. He experienced he talks about that experience as the time that he experienced what it was like to be Black, to be understood as African American within a specific context, even though he grew up in a different environment. And he just says, he's like, I have lived both of these lives. And the reality is that you can't just remove people without having a place for people to live and where they can be accepted. And he completely changes the way that a public housing plan operates by him coming forward and advocating. And he acts as a person who's able to navigate between two communities. But his experience and being Afro-Latino and being Afro-Cuban is something that was central to him and very much lived. And so when you're, the ideas of who is seen and who's not seen, there is a long history of Afro-Latinidad in the South, right? Even if, it isn't something that we all often talk about, but need to more often.
Yeah. Other questions?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation of fascinating histories and informations. South of border, I've stopped at one time, and I'll just never forget how bad the food was and that they charged you to go to the bathroom. So it's
another strike against it.
My sister and I are Cuban Americans, De Leons, and we learned in the 90s that our history, Dad came from Cuba in the late 30s to get away from some civil unrest and met our mother, and his sister met her brother, and that was the end of that. So we were not really raised so much in the Cuban culture, but we always loved the relatives that would come and spend a summer or a year to learn English and teach us great dances, and they were always so exotic. But we learned that our family history was that we are Sephardic Jews. Now, my father was raised Catholic, and what we learned was that the name De Leon is from the province, the area of province or town of Leon, that many of the Jewish people were scientists and doctors and were valued by the court. So during the Inquisition, they were given the chance to change their identity, so to speak, and many of them adopted the name of the place they lived. And we have confirmed that through genetic testing of our father's side of the family. It was always a family history, or secret rather, and a mystery. So there's a whole other layer to talking about identity. And we were raised, Protestant and Southern Baptist. And so, all that to reckon with. But I guess the question I have is, in all your work, have you been able or touched on the idea of genealogy? Because getting history from Cuba is extremely difficult, if not impossible. And I don't know about other countries, but Ancestry.com is a little more Euro white.
Oh, we love Ancestry.com.
Big fans.
I spend too much time on
But
Ancestry.com.
we know all about the Anglo side of the family, but we can't get anything.
You can. You absolutely can. So Ancestry.com, in case you all don't know, is very useful, and it has become very useful for historians. We are big fans of Ancestry. Ancestry can help you track down the census, right? You can have direct access to how people are reporting or talking about themselves, but you can also get all sorts of other information, right? You can get histories of migration and immigration. You can know who is crossing a border and when.
You can also look at historical censuses, which, by the way, for Latinos is wild.
It is.
Because the way they categorize them racially is like absolutely bananas.
Yep. And immigration documents are interesting. Cuban, for example, or as you are if you're looking at immigration records, ideas or what we would think of as ethnicity are oftentimes racialized. So Cuban is always listed as a race during the periods of time that I'm writing about, and you can actually shift to and see when that changes. But in terms of documents of Cuban Americans from Ancestry, you absolutely can. You would need to filter down your search terms to the first person who came, and then you would enter their information, and you will start to get documents. It wouldn't be the Cuban government's information, but Ancestry is broadly a U.S.-based platform, right? So there is information about people from other places, but that is individually and self-imported, not in the same way of it's all based on which governments are giving and importing these documents into the system. Right, so you absolutely can trace, and I can tell you this because the beginning of my book my book opens with the story of this woman named Amelia Alvarez, and it traces her migration, how she comes to the U.S. So I talk about the boat that she's on, how much it costs for her to be on it, where she entered, all of these different elements about her life. And I tracked her down because she's my great-great-grandmother. She was the first woman in my family to come to Florida, come to the United States. And I started that research really with just a name, right? I knew all these things about her, right? That she was my grandmother's favorite grandparent. I knew that she hated the beach. I knew that she loved to read. I knew these different things about her, but I didn't know, her story. Because those aren't necessarily the things that we think of that are important about people. It's instead their personalities and who they are and how they lived, right? Those are the stories that we pass down, not the nitty-gritty information. So it's more a process of identifying that person and then specifying your search terms, and you will be able to and start to find information about them. Yep.
Well, I think we're probably right at time, right? Am I making that up?
We probably have time for one more question. There was one more hand that had gone up.
Want to do one more question? Okay. But whose hand was it?
I don't remember, but if you're
Call
over
them
it, that's
out.
okay, guys.
Okay. Okay.
It's okay, everyone.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
we just wanted to thank Alex again. Thank the Levine. Thank Carrie for the work that they did producing this exhibit. This event. We want to thank you all so much for coming out.
And big thank you to Alex.
Yes, Alex, Carrie. Yeah.
Yes.
And thank you to the Carolina Migrant Resource Center, who is selling our book today as part of a fundraiser. So please buy the book. We'll sign the book.
We'll sign it. I happen to have some Ybor City bookmarks with me.
Christmas and Hanukkah will
there we
sneak right
go.
up on you. So if you're looking for good gifts, this is a great one. But yes, thank you again for everything. And we'll look forward to talking to you with signing the books and stuff. And please enjoy some food in the back.
Sounds great.
Thank you.